Welcome to the German Nagoya Protocol Hub's podcast series, Nagoya Bites. Nagoya Bites is all about helping researchers in the academic sector in Germany with understanding their obligations arising from the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. My name is Elizabeth Karger, or you can call me Liz. I'm the manager of the German Nagoya Protocol Hub, or the GMP Hub for short, and I'm your host today. I'm delighted that you've tuned in. If you find this podcast useful, or you'd like to suggest a topic for a future podcast, don't forget to let us know via the contact form on the GNP Hub website. You can find the link in the show notes. This is our second episode of Nagoya Bites, and in today's episode we'll focus on the topic of compliance and how it is dealt with in German academic institutions. EU Regulation 511 of 2014 applies to both individuals but also legal entities, meaning that universities and research institutions also have obligations to ensure compliance with access and benefit sharing rules. Finding the right strategy to ensure compliance in an institution can be very challenging. In Germany, a number of institutions are just starting to address compliance, but there is some good news. There are institutions out there that have already made really good progress. And in our podcast today, we'll discuss how Kiel University has tackled compliance at the institutional level. We hope that this can provide some insight for other universities and research institutions in Germany that are looking to implement a Nagoya compliance strategy. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Scarlett Sett. She officially became the university's compliance officer back in 2019, but before that, she was instrumental in building up the different components of Kiel University's Nagoya Protocol compliance strategy, starting way back in 2017. So, Scarlett, welcome and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Liz, for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here.
Let's just dive straight in. Can you tell me what the main elements of this strategy are?
So I think the first and most important one was the awareness raising component. So if people do not really understand why and how they are affected by the Nagoya Protocol or what their obligations might come from that, then it's really hard to implement any measures for compliance. So the second component has to do with institutional policies or guidelines, and this is basically to do with the separation of responsibilities and a clear definition of what is expected of the researchers and the compliance officers. And the last category is an internal tracking system. So this is more for the institution to keep track about how many projects have open ABS processes and how we can support our researchers in complying with any obligations that they might have.
Well, we'll come back to this and these three different components or pillars of the compliance strategy in a moment. But before we do, I just wanted to ask you, where did all of this start back in 2017? Can you tell us a little bit about how this began?
During one of those first talks that I had at the biology department, just talking in general about the Nagoya Protocol, that the head of the EU office at the university approached me and said that they didn't know how to deal with issues related to this with EU projects because there was no one to ask from. So from this point forward, it evolved into something with a more urgent issue in terms of importance for the university. So it was not only EU international projects, it was also projects that had national funding, but that were getting material from abroad.
And what happened next? What was the process? How did the ball get rolling, and who was involved?
So I have to be honest, it was a combination of both academic and administrative staff that was involved in the process. So the more I read about what the Nagoya Protocol entailed for research, the more I realized that it affected beyond my immediate community at the time. I was lucky that back in 2017, my boss was a direct user of genetic resources. So they were using it for different types of experiments. But I had also someone in the administration that understood what a burden this could be if we would be found non-compliant, so namely the head of the EU office. And both of these players, so both the academic and the administrative, were able to support me to bring this information at a higher level at the university, for the university board to take into consideration.
And what were there any challenges kind of in these early stages? And if so, what were they?
Yes, I think at the beginning, of course, if everything is new, and especially if it will bring quite significant changes to how you normally do things, there was a lot of hesitation and denial and frustration. So I had to find a common language. I had to find ways to efficiently communicate this very complex topic or concepts into digestible bites of information for the researchers. So I couldn't talk with a legal language to a scientist, and I couldn't talk about science to the administrative staff. So it was a learning process for me as well to find this balance on what and how to communicate efficiently between the groups and what type of information was relevant for each.
So in other words, at these early stages, clear communication with the different actors, the relevant actors at the institution is very important.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's maybe go back to the compliance strategy itself, starting with the institutional policies. Can you give us an overview of the main elements?
Yeah, so I have a simplified 4-step process, which I'm currently revising and expanding to have a formal guidelines document for the university board to be approved. So for the update of this, I am actually using some of the resources that you have on the GNP Hub. So it will be definitely something that will help me complement and add points that I might have overlooked in the past. Nonetheless, there are still 4 main kind of points that still apply, and you can think of as this conditional logic survey. Whether you answer yes or no, it will take you to a to the next step, what you have to follow. So the first step is the basic one. It's a project assessment. So is this project does this project would use any material that would be that would have any access and benefit sharing obligations? Yes or no. If no, then of course then the process stops there. If yes, then you go to the second point, which is provide country-specific information and draft emails for the first contact to the researcher. So this means that I've already created some draft documents to the researchers to contact the national focal points of the countries in which they will be taking their genetic resources to ask if they would have any obligations or if they have to go through a specific process. So if the reply from the national focal point says no, then the process stops here at step 2. If the process says yes, then we go to step 3, which is where we provide support and advice in completing documents for the application. And this includes getting the proper signatures at the university and advice from the legal department if there are contracts to be signed. And the last step, if applicable, then the support of the submission of the due diligence declaration.
So you mentioned that you're developing formal guidelines that will expand on this existing policy or 4-step process that you have. So in what way will that be different?
So the guidelines will basically complement the existing policies. It will put something into like a binding document for the university, but they will expand, for example, on the separation of responsibilities and tasks for each player. So namely for us, the researchers, what is expected from them, and then also from the compliance officer, what is expected for the compliance officer or the university, how can we support the process.
And so the support is obviously an important part of the strategy itself. You mentioned it already. There's support and advice in making contact with the national focal point. There's support with submitting due diligence. So can you maybe say a little bit more about your job?
Yeah, so my main responsibility is to provide our researchers with information, tools, and resources that will help them comply with the protocol and the EU ABS regulation. If they have to go through an ABS process, then I would also support them from the beginning to end. This does not mean that I will negotiate and prepare all the documents for them. This is their responsibility, but I'm here to answer any questions or make sure that if there's any red flags in the different documents that they are aware of these. And at the university, we determined that the researcher, as the main user of the resource, will be the one responsible for compliance, and we provide them then with resources to follow through the process.
And can you give us an example where you've helped a researcher in the past, what you actually did?
Yes, I think a very simple one, and it goes like starting from the beginning of the project, is if we do determine that the project will be within the scope of the Nagoya Protocol and the EU ABS regulation, then I will provide them with draft emails to contact the national focal points for the different countries. So it is something that might sound very simple, right? But this standardizes the way in which we ask questions and what will be the wording that we use, so that the person on the other side of the email will understand. So I encourage them not to send like 3 pages of a project idea, because most likely the people will not understand that. So keep the email simple and with common terminology. So usually I am on CC on these emails, and then I can follow through the process if there is one.
And you mentioned before that the main responsibilities remain with the individual scientist. So what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so the researcher will be the main contact point. They are responsible for sending the emails and signing any documents. They also have to adhere and respect the restrictions set forth in such documents. The university will not have the capacity to check everybody's lab at the university for compliance, but they should know that what they are allowed and not allowed to do with the resources that they got. That's, I think, by having them sign the documents, you ensure that they have hopefully read through the documents and understood what are their obligations and responsibilities. Maybe it's important here to add that the individual scientists that we're referring to here are either professors or senior scientists with permanent positions, because if we have the high turnover rate of people leaving, then we don't want a PhD student or a postdoc that will leave in 2 years that will sign the contracts, and then the material cannot be further used at the university. So the responsible scientists, in our case at the university, will be the heads of department, basically.
Okay, so let's go back to this idea of awareness raising. This is also one pillar of the compliance strategy, and it's also the one that you said that you started with. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you went about this and what kind of instruments you used to raise awareness at the university?
Yes, so one of the first things that I also developed was the university website. So it's available both in German and in English, and it's like publicly available, so you don't have to be in the intranet to access it. And it has general information about what the Nagoya Protocol is, and what the EU ABS regulation is, and what are the obligations that as researchers at the university you might have. I have simplified the way in which I explain or presented the concepts or the definitions to make it more digestible and easy and quick to read. There's information about the legal consequences of non-compliance and a checklist to determine whether the proposed use of the material falls within the scope of the EU ABS regulation. And we also have like an example of a standard MTA for Nagoya Protocol relevant material and the contact details of the compliance officer. And the content took several months to develop and involved also support from the German competent authority.
So you said before that you've communicated directly with researchers and also the university administration so that people understand what the obligations are. Can you tell me a little bit more about these communication activities?
Yeah, so I have different types of presentations that I was giving at the beginning of the whole process. So it was also important for me to offer these informational talks to staff at the university, and those were very different to the ones that I offer to scientists. So the ones that I offered to the administration were only like 20-minute presentations that were really short, just what's important for the administration, like in terms of support and what's expected of them. And the ones that I offer for researchers, those I offer like 2 or 3 times a year. They're like 45-minute presentations where I really go through the definitions, through examples, so a little more detail. And I offer them through the graduate center, which are like anybody that is like registered as a student at the university, PhDs, masters. But we are expanding this year to the postdoc and the further education centers.
So in other words, you're doing awareness raising regularly. It's an ongoing activity. Is there a reason for this?
Yeah, so the main reason for this ongoing awareness raising events is because the turnover rate of students is quite high. So PhDs and postdocs come and go often, and you need to make sure that the ones that are working directly with the researchers know about their potential obligations and responsibilities. So it's good to keep this in mind if they're going and doing experiments abroad and taking material from abroad back to Germany.
So let's come back to the last component of the compliance strategy, which you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. This is about tracking and tracing, documentation, and the university knowing what ABS-related research is actually taking place. Can you tell us a bit more about the approach taken by the university? Is it a centralized tracking and tracing system, or is it decentralized?
It's not a truly centralized process, so the responsibility to store and document all the relevant paperwork still will remain with the researcher and their respective working groups or departments. So the only centralized activity that we have is the submission of a due diligence declaration through the Declare portal. So we have a university account that will invite the users, so the researchers, and they can submit under their respective names. So the storing of the documents will stay with the researcher at their respective institutions.
And what happens if researchers work out that their research actually falls outside of the scope of the EU regulation?
Yes, so even if the research does not fall within the scope of the EU regulation, they might still have obligations with the country providing the genetic resources. So it could be that there will not be a due diligence declaration, but they might still have an access and benefit sharing process, so an ABS process, and therefore they still have to keep all the relevant documentation to prove that they've legally acquired that material.
And apart from storing the documentation, are there other ways of tracing documentation at the university?
Yes, another way in which we track and trace whether material is being utilized that could be potentially under the Nagoya Protocol is through the Material Transfer Agreement, so MTAs. So every MTA that the university has to sign goes through the technology transfer team. We have briefed them about what the Nagoya Protocol is and what could be the potential obligations, and kind of said, okay, as soon as there's any biological material listed in the MTA, it automatically goes to the Nagoya Protocol office. And we have to check whether it indeed needs further information or not, and to assess whether it's an ABS case. So as a general rule, even if the material does not fall under the scope of the Nagoya Protocol and the EU ABS regulation, I always recommend to add where the material was collected and when. So if you have the country of origin or country of collection and date of collection, this way we can always track back why a specific material might not have had any obligations. So all MTAs that are signed through the technology transfer team, whether it gets our approval from us or not, will also be assigned a case number, and they will be stored at the university.
And that they're stored centrally?
Yes, they're stored centrally.
Okay, and you also mentioned this at the beginning, but I'll just quickly mention it again. You talked about the Declare system, which is the way that due diligence declarations are made, and that the university has a centralized account, so all of the researchers who are submitting a due diligence declaration go to you, and you sort of oversee this process.
Yes. So if a researcher will have to submit a due diligence declaration, by this point, most likely we've already had contact because I would help them. It hasn't happened so far that someone has gone through the ABS process without me knowing about it. Because if you need to have certain signatures from the administration, then they will always refer them to me. The idea with having a centralized account is also because sometimes people use different names for the same institution. And then you have like 10 people submitting due diligence declarations for the same institution on the different names. So people use the German name, some people use the English name. So what we try to do here is like standardize it. I have the main account, and once they tell me, okay, I'm ready to submit my due diligence, then I invite them to this big account, and they are added to the big umbrella of the university, but it's still under their names that they submit the due diligence.
So a lot has been done at the university. It sounds like these processes are working well, that the researchers are informed and know what they need to do, or at least who they need to go to and ask for support if they need it. So when this compliance strategy was first implemented, how did the researchers at the university react?
When I started contacting people or asking for documentation, I think at the beginning they were very frustrated with the situation. So in practice, it just means that they need to do more paperwork. And this is, no one likes more paperwork. So also a lot of the research that is done at the university is not so black and whitely defined as in the legal documents, so you have really to assess on a case by case if you are new to the topic. And it can be overwhelming if you're new to the whole thing. And I think over the past year, this attitude has changed a little bit, and they are just happy to have someone that understands the process and can guide them through it. They're still not happy that they have to do more documentation and paperwork and processes, but at least, now not all institutions have a dedicated person to do this. So sometimes people do this on top of their responsibilities. So at the university, it's quite a luxury that they have a designated person that completely takes care of these issues.
Yeah, and then from what we've heard, this type of institutional support is really key to making compliance work well. Otherwise, a lot of researchers feel very alone and quite lost. This is the feedback that we've got, at least through the German Nagoya Protocol Hub. Yeah, so we're almost at the end of the podcast today. So to finish up, I just thought it might be nice if you could just summarize for us what you think the most important lessons learned have been through this process of developing and also implementing a Nagoya Protocol compliance strategy, and perhaps what you would recommend to someone who's in a similar position to you and has to go through this process.
Yeah, I think one of the crucial things, at least in my experience, was to get support from the main administration to establish and support the compliance strategies, right? So it was not a one-woman job. It was really a team effort. And like I said at the beginning, I was really happy that the science part understood and the administrative part also understood, and then that we together could bring this topic further for the university to give it more importance. I think it's also really important to have a clear division of responsibilities and tasks. At some point, it has to say clearly what is the researcher responsible for, what is the administrative responsible for, and how we support and complement each other. The institution ideally should have someone designed to be responsible for this topic, because once the initial frustration and denial is overcome, I think people are really glad that there is someone to help them. It is not always an easy process, but at least they'll have a better understanding of what to expect and how to do it. I think it does take a lot of time for someone to understand what the implications of this topic is. Not only the Nagoya Protocol, but also access and benefit sharing. So you still might not have any Nagoya Protocol obligations, so to say, but a country might still have national laws that you have to respect. And you have to be aware of this and to keep this in mind when you are assessing the different projects. So it goes a little bit further than just the Nagoya. So you have to have someone that really understands the issue and not just superficially. And if you don't have someone working on the topic more exclusively, then it can be easy to overlook. And just for the people, just some words of encouragement for the people that will be working in similar positions to mine, that you shouldn't take people's frustration personally, but change the narrative and say, we are your advocates. We're here to help you and to guide you through the process and support you in whichever way we can. So we cannot change the law, unfortunately, and it will be something that we're going to have to live with. So might as well do it right already now.
And of course, as we know, there are implications for both the individual researchers and also the institutions themselves from non-compliance. And as you said, it's a reality, something that has to be dealt with. There's no way around it, so you may as well do it properly. Okay, well, Scarlett, thank you so much for your time today. That was extremely informative, and hopefully it can help other institutions to move compliance forward across Germany. So, thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, Liz, and I also hope that this will be helpful to others while setting up their compliance strategies.
So we've reached the end of today's episode, and it's time to say goodbye. Thank you for tuning in to Nagoya Bites. Don't forget to check out the GMP Hub website for lots of other useful information about Nagoya Protocol compliance. And of course, if you still have questions, you can reach out to us through the contact form. What did you think of our podcast? If you have any feedback for us, you can also let us know through the contact form. And if you have suggestions for future topics, you can leave those there as well. For regular updates on the GMP Hub, you can follow us on Twitter, or you can check out the news section of the website. Keep an eye out for upcoming episodes of Nagoya Bites. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.